Okay then, so RX 580, well, let's cut to the chase here. It's an overclocked RX 480. And well, there we go. Do like and subscribe to support Digital Foundry, and I'll see you next time. All right, you want more? Okay, well, let's do it. Okay then, so AMD calls the top-end RX cards in the 500 series Polaris refined, and that's kind of exactly what we're getting really. According to the Red Team, we are now on 3rd generation 14nm FinFET production technology, and that means that we can push the existing RX 470 and 480 to significantly higher clocks, and of course that means improved performance. RX 580 takes on the GTX 1060 in both 3GB and 6GB forms. Okay, so let's look at some specs. No real surprises here. The 580 is literally identical in terms of core configuration to its predecessor. So we're looking at 36 4th generation GCN compute units, and yes, clock speeds are improved over the 480. The 580 essentially increases the 480's maximum boost clock of 1266 MHz to about 1340 MHz. Okay, so that's nice, but it's not exactly thrilling. But here's the thing, there's not really going to be a reference 580. Instead, the likes of Sapphire, MSI and Asus can do their own thing, and that means more power via factory overclocks, which kind of widens the gap. Okay, so the MSI 580 here hits almost 1393 MHz, while this Sapphire model, well, that's quite remarkable, hitting 1450 MHz out of the box. So yeah, I would say that the 500 series is a bit more than a rebrand of the older cards. They really do go quite a bit faster in terms of clocks at least. And well, maybe it's a different story with aftermarket coolers and whatnot, but my reference 480, there's more chance of me winning the lottery than there is of this thing hitting 1.45 GHz. But to what extent does all of this actually change the lie of the land in terms of the mainstream GPU landscape? Okay, so in theory, even if the reference 480 could sustain max clocks all of the time, this Sapphire card should notionally be 15% faster. But well, unfortunately, it kind of isn't. Assassin's Creed Unity, there's only a 7% uplift, dropping to around 2% with the MSI model here. Ashes of the Singularity, Sapphire card about 9.5% faster. The MSI version, again, only 2% ahead. We do see better results with Crysis 3 though. Sapphire powers ahead by around 11% versus 8.5% on the MSI edition. The biggest improvement I could find was Rise of the Tomb Raider. The Sapphire 580 powers ahead of the reference 480 by around 13%, the MSI variant by around 10%. But you can see the problem here, can't you? We're comparing factory overclocked 580s to a reference 480. And the reality is that if we stacked up factory overclocked versions of both cards, the gap would close up significantly. And while we are getting higher frequencies on the 580s, there seems to be a law of diminishing returns kicking in terms of the actual frame rates we're getting as a result. Put simply, the 580 is essentially a replacement for the 480. It's not actually a huge improvement. I mean, that's kind of fine actually. I mean, fundamentally, there's nothing wrong with the 480. If you subscribe to our channel, we often run detailed in-game performance tests where the 480 regularly holds its own against the more popular GTX 1060, even when the benchmarks say that Nvidia has the faster card generally, certainly in DX11 titles. The reality is that AMD offers more RAM, great performance and a cheaper price point. And now, with the release of the 580, the 480 is essentially a bit faster, and that's okay, right? I mean, yes, but at the same time, giving it a new name makes it sound like it's something different, faster, better, when the real-life performance is essentially still in the same ballpark and it's using the same technology. I mean, the MSI card here is much closer to the reference 580 spec than the Sapphire, and the minuscule performance boosts we're seeing against the 480 in some cases is really sitting just above the margin of error. It is what it is, an RX 480, just with slight tweaks to the clocks. Okay, well, let's stack up the two 580s I've got here physically. The Sapphire card is really quite awesome actually, and yeah, it's a very cool design, but man, it's quite a unit. It's huge and weighty and has both 6-pin and 8-pin power inputs. Remember when the RX line was supposed to be about power efficiency? That seems to have gone out of the window with this one. The MSI model here has a significantly smaller thermal solution and only requires one 8-pin power input. But I am actually quite surprised at how the fan needs to kick in on this card. I mean, I'm struggling to think of an MSI gaming card I've seen in the past that isn't anything other than whisper quiet at stock frequencies. So what about the GTX 1060 then? Well, I've only got a reference card here, the Founders Edition, but the trend pretty much speaks for itself. On Assassin's Creed Unity, the two 580s I have beat the 3GB 1060, but the 6GB model still a touch faster, and the gap would probably open up a bit with a similarly factory overclocked 6GB 1060. However, elsewhere in DX11 land, AMD does indeed catch up. Crysis 3 sees the MSI model close the gap with the 6GB 1060, while the Sapphire card actually pulls ahead a bit. The Witcher 3 is faster, but only by a nose, and remember that factory OCs are in place on the red side. But the point is that overall, we're competitive. Far Cry Primal is interesting in that both 580s hand in identical scores, but we're still doing well against the GTX 1060 here. Good stuff. Now with DX12, things get more interesting. I've switched the Division to its DX12 renderer for our benchmarks now, and both of the 580s are at least 10% faster than the GTX 1060. Now, Nvidia has recently revamped its DX12 driver, resulting in better performance on Ashes of the Singularity and Hitman, games that have traditionally hammered the Pascal bench results. Well, the 1060 is now on par with the RX 480 in Ashes, but the 580s kind of move the goalposts, about 7 to 8% faster depending on which card you measure. Hitman DX12, yeah, Nvidia's done some work here. So again, a reference 1060 will beat a reference 480, but the 580s reclaim performance leadership. But check out what's going on with the 3GB 1060 there. Hitman simply runs out of memory here, resulting in a big performance downgrade. It's like a kind of pitched battle is taking place in the world of mainstream GPU benchmarking. Driver revisions pushing up performance, and now the 500 series inching ahead by virtue of its frequency bumps. But again, I think the main point is that whether we're talking about 480s, 580s or 1060s, for the most part, they are pretty much the same. The overall grouping of results is actually pretty similar overall, especially with DX11. And in this sector of the market, with so many factory overclocks in play, benchmarking results will become even more of a blur. Now, generally speaking, personally, I find it really hard to choose between 480, 580 and 1060 as a result. I'd happily game on all of them, though if I had an older or less capable CPU, the 1060 would be my go-to card. But with something like a modern i5, again, if you're not really concerned about power efficiency, I think you'd struggle to tell the difference in terms of actual gameplay experiences. And I suppose in a way that's good news. They're all great products for 1080p gameplay, and that's awesome. But obviously there is a differential somewhere along the line. So let's talk power consumption and overclocking. And it's here where we pay the price for the RX 580's frequency bump. The MSI model actually gets off pretty lightly with an increase of just 20 watts over the reference 480. But the superclocked Sapphire model here, well, that adds an extra 56 watts to hit that tremendous 1450 megahertz boost clock. I mean, it's getting on for consuming an extra 90 watts there compared to the reference GTX 1060 6GB card. And this is measuring peak system load, by the way, though I have disabled the i7's overclock for these tests. And so yeah, by extension, overclocking isn't great. For the Sapphire card, I can only add 10 megahertz to the core before it becomes unstable. 10 megahertz! I think that's a new record for me in terms of the lack of overclocking headroom. On the plus side though, the G5 memory easily hits 9 gigabits per second. Now, what the MSI model lacks in frequency out of the box, you can easily make up via overclocking, and I found that it hit the same maximum 1460 megahertz in terms of stable core clocks. And yes, the same 9 gigabits per second on the 8 gigs of memory. So how does that stack up in terms of performance? Well, kind of a lot of not much, to be honest, an extra 1 to 2 frames per second. And yes, your power consumption is obviously hit harder. So yeah, bearing in mind the extra power and the kind of limited return, I'm not sure if overclocking is worth the bother, to be honest. Now, if you're looking for a nice overclockable Radeon card, well, the RX 570 is very nice there, but more on that in a later video. In the meantime, I'm going to wrap this one up. I mean, ultimately, the RX 480 was and is a great card, and the RX 580 is effectively the same thing, just with a meaty overclock in place. especially the Sapphire Nitro model here, which really does push the core kind of kicking and screaming to its limits. But fundamentally, RX 580 is not a game changer. It's not going to stop GTX 1060 continuing to sell like gangbusters, even though there's a pretty decent performance story here. And we know that AMD's Vega is coming along really soon now. Now, personally, I would have preferred to see that launch at the top end first, then scale down to the mainstream with an RX 580 that does actually shake up the market, just like the 480 did 10 months ago. At the very least, I hope this Polaris relaunch does at least propel the RX 570 into the limelight. I'll be looking at that one really soon, and suffice to say, just like the 470, it is a bit of a winner when it comes to bang for the buck. But that's all from me for now. As always, do like, subscribe, and consider supporting our Patreon, where you can access pristine quality download versions of all of our videos. But from me, for now, thanks for watching.